good afternoon, and welcome to this episode of the METAVERSIAL Minute. Today is Jim O'Shea, great asset here in the Triangle area of North Carolina. Really pleased that you moved here, Jim, and we just met through some mutual friends, local technologists in the last couple of months. But Jim was an editor, managing editor for the Chicago Tribune, and spent some time also as an editor for the LA Times. Has had a just incredible career, a lot of great perspective on what's going on in journalism. And now you're also on the board of let me get this right, the Middle East Broadcasting Network. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So maybe we'll get to that too and what that means. But yeah, again, really pleased to have you. And what we're going to talk about today is the state of journalism, the fourth estate in the metaverse. And God, how do we get it right this time as we continue to advance our technology? So Jim, just if you could just give the audience a little bit more about your background that maybe I didn't cover in that short introduction.
Okay. Well, I spent a lot of years as a reporter and a correspondent at the Chicago Tribune, then at the LA Times when I was executive editor. I also oversaw a lot of the foreign, national, local, all of the news. I've written 3 books, and including one on the newspaper industry, the decline of the newspaper industry, called The Deal from Hell. And it's a story about the merger of the Times Mirror Company and the Tribune Company, and how it disastrously fell into the hands of a real estate developer named Sam Zell, who basically called it The Deal from Hell and gave me my title. The Middle East Broadcasting Networks is a arm of the State Department, and it was created by the Bush administration, the last Bush administration, to promote objective and fair news in the Middle East. It's in a part of the Office of Global Media, or the Agency for Global Media at the State Department, and that includes the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and several others. So it has a huge audience. We serve 22 markets with about 33 million viewers in the Middle East and North Africa. And so that's my latest adventure. And I'm also, working on a historical novel, and I've got too many things to do.
Well, again, I'm really pleased that you moved to this area, and you and I had a chance to have a lunch, and I'm sure we're going to have many more lunches talking about all these issues and all these events that are happening so quickly. And we're going to get to ChatGPT and some of those technologies, but I think back to when the Clue Train Manifesto came out right after we formed the graphical internet in 1993, where there were all these hopes and aspirations and guidance around, what's this going to mean? What is the internet going to mean for information technology and for communication, the battle of narratives that are out there? And the hope was that it would empower all of us to become publishers. And therefore, we should have a much richer, deeper community conversation around every subject. And instead, social media popped up. And once again, we found ourselves with a couple of monolithic or just a short list of folks controlling information flow, even though they would say they don't control it. And that democratization of opinion hasn't gone so well, has it? So what do you think went wrong in all of that?
Well, I think several things. First of all, the newspaper industry, of which I was a part, resisted a lot of this and wanted to remain in control of the information, not for devious reasons or anything. There were good reasons. They felt that there was a lot of misinformation and inaccurate information flowing out in many social media sites. So it rejected the idea of getting involved with these social media sites. It rejected, in large part, the idea of civic journalism. And as a result, you just had this struggle And then the biggest part was the economics of the social media really destroyed the business model for newspapers. And when that occurred and the newspapers began failing, well, the journalism just kind of really went topsy-turvy. What a lot of people don't realize is that even though newspapers were, they weren't that big of a part, a lot of people said, I don't read a newspaper. And I'd always ask them, well, do you listen to National Public Radio? And they'd say, yes. I said, well, you're reading a newspaper, because that's what they're doing. They go to the newspapers and they figure out what are the big stories, what stories should we be covering, and then they go do their own versions of that story. But the news agenda was being set by editors like myself at major newspapers. And then because the NPR and places like that simply didn't have the staff that we did, and to cover like this courthouse and the city hall and all of that. So I think the financial really destruction of the newspaper industry, which is still ongoing. We're losing newspapers at about the rate of about 2 a week, and that's still underway. And I think that really hurt the development of this audience of where people. What really happened is, when you're under threat like that, when you're under a financial threat, I think you tend to look inward and you kind of crouch down. And you don't really welcome innovation, and you really don't welcome newer ways of doing things. And so I think that really happened in journalism. And so it was a disastrous story, because the number of journalists now is about half of what it was in the year 2000. So it's not been a pretty picture.
Well, I think that's the nature of every big technological advance, is that it has this disruptive force. And I forget how the quote goes, but it's something like, anytime you see a big transformation like this, you have only lukewarm defenders among those who seek to take advantage of the new system. But then the old system, you've got people who are really digging in their heels, and are fighting it, but just because they're like, hey, we've got this. This is the way we do things. We understand this world. We've got it organized, and they're fighting for it tooth and nail. So disruption, any kind of innovation is always difficult. But in this case, I feel like the guardians of the old system actually might have had it right, because watching how we've democratized opinion and power of voice out there, it's not been a good thing, because you have people with, only half-baked opinions, and out there expressing themselves, and it seems to have equal weight with what the editors of the New York Times have to say. And I don't think that's, expertise, and it really does matter, right?
It does matter, and it's really disheartening to see some of this occurring, because newspapers did one thing well. Every day we sat down and we sat around a table and we debated what were the most significant and what were the most important stories of the day. And we arranged them in a hierarchy, which a lot of people don't like, but it was a hierarchy of, okay, the top story was the headline that spread across the top of your paper. And you basically sat down and you brought some order to the news. I always looked at it as it was a process in which you sat down and you took the news of the day and you put it in a context that gave it meaning to people. And that is what's lost. Now it's just a jumble, and you just look at things and it's flying at you like crazy. Part of it was the newspaper industry's fault, because, as you say, it was quite resistant to innovation. I remember once when I was managing editor of the Tribune, I set up a kind of a little skunk works down in the basement of the Tribune Tower, because I didn't want anybody to know what we were doing. And their task was, let's see how we can use the internet to improve storytelling and improve news and improve the coverage of news. And I finally got it going, and we began producing at that time, the big technology was CD-ROMs, and we began producing CD-ROMs about news events. We began producing books. We began producing a lot of things. And I went to the publisher of the paper and I said, I'd like to continue this. And if and I will, you know, all the new revenue we generate, I would like to take and push it back into the newspaper to try and reinvest in the content. He said, absolutely not. You send it to the top, to the top of the Tribune Tower where all the financial people sat, and so that just went by the boards. You know, we just didn't have the wherewithal to continue doing it.
Yeah, back in 2000, I was working with New York Times Digital, right? And we ended up making a model, started building a 3D model we were serving up on the internet of, like, we started in Times Square, we started building the rest of New York, and they had a lot of energy and momentum behind that, and money. So they were giving us money, we were building things, and then of course when the dot-com bubble crashed, all that money just immediately froze while everyone had to think about what they want to do next. Whereas I feel like I was kind of hoping that they would double down on that part of it, but they didn't. They just pulled back.
Well,
we were building the 3D metaverse of New York in 2000 with New York Times Digital.
Where there were all kinds of, the Tribune Company actually was a pretty innovative company for a newspaper company. But, you know, the one thing that happened is as the revenue began declining, they began treating it like it was a cost problem. I remember saying to him, you know, we have a revenue problem and you keep treating it like it's a cost problem. And the more you treat it like a cost problem, the worse your revenue problem gets. And that's exactly what happened. And so when they had the money and they could have invested in these kinds of technologies and these kinds of innovations, they were basically trying to satisfy Wall Street by boosting earnings and dividends and stock prices. And the result was that it all collapsed on them, on the industry.
So we talked about this during our lunch, that there was this consolidation and some of the business model issues with national news organizations. But the biggest issue from my perspective, at least what I've seen, is the local newspapers. Yes. Because like you said, the local media, especially small town newspapers, even mid-sized towns like Raleigh and Chapel Hill and Greensboro, they rely on those editors at the Tribune companies and elsewhere for their national news. So they take that, they syndicate it, and they reprint it. But then they also had this handful of investigative journalists who were serving as a check and balance against the local political efforts out there, the town councils who were trying to, do rapid growth without doing traffic studies or having to do any of those sort of impact investment studies, only looking for profit. And, what we've seen along with the national media having difficulty is the small ones have just been disappearing, and especially the investigative journalism. So we're not seeing those checks and balances with local politics, and that's beginning to echo, I believe. But I'm interested to hear what you think about that or what you've been seeing.
Well, I've seen that. I think that's where most of when you talk about papers closing at the rate of 2 a week, it's mostly small newspapers. They just can't hack it anymore. Excuse me. The problem has been the smaller papers. They're owned by chains, Gannett, Alliance Media, all those big chains, and they own these papers and they buy them, and then they basically figure out how can I produce as much news as I can by investing as little as I can in the newsroom. And so they use a lot of wire copy from the AP and places like that, and then they cut back on local reporters, and they cut back on local editors and copy editors and all of the people who really make the paper work. And it's going to continue because the economics of social media are just basically favor large news organizations. So you can't, and so the advertising revenue has just it's just disappeared. And what happens now is those small papers are struggling to survive. and they just keep getting cut and cut and cut, and they're keeping them. They keep them alive for the little bit of ad revenue that trickles in. The circulation revenue has. I mean, newspapers have always been the organizations where the circulation revenue basically covered your costs, and the advertising was profit. And and then the other thing is, the other problem the newspaper industry had is from the earliest time, from the 1890s and the early part of the 19th century, when the newspaper came to be as an organization which had circulation revenue and advertising revenue. We use the advertising revenue to keep the circulation price low to grow your circulation. And so we condition people to get the news cheap and for free. And now people resist paying for it. And particularly in the smaller organizations, when you got a little paper like that, some people will continue paying for it. I mean, I subscribe to a couple of local papers simply to support them. I don't.
That's the thing. I don't subscribe to anything locally, but I have my subscription to the New York Times, and it's something ridiculous, like it's $5, $10 a month, something like that. And I do it just to support it, but also I don't want to be behind those paywalls when I'm on social media and I click on an article and I go there and it says, well, you've already read your 4. You can't read them anymore, and I can't stand that. So I'd rather pay for it. But I don't think many people do anymore.
No. And the small papers, you're right, are bearing the brunt of this. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they're still profitable. They're still making money, but they have their problems too. And you will see. I mean, I think just recently I heard of layoffs at the Washington Post. So I guess things aren't going as well there as everybody thought. The New York Times had its writers striking because of low pay. So, they are having these kinds of problems too. But on a little local paper, they just get rid of it. I mean, I read one story where there was like one reporter left. It covered the whole town.
And that's, I think, part of the issue here is that now that social media has become the preferred news source, especially for the younger generation, I mean, that's where they get their news. Yeah. And much of that news has not been vetted. It's subject to easy manipulation by inside and outside forces around the world. We all know about this, and we're watching it. And so our democracy is vulnerable. The reason we have the fourth estate is in Europe it was like the clergy and the royalty and the commoners were the 3 estates, and then there was a fourth. I think I can't remember how it works, but here we think about their executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. And then the fourth branch is the check and balance of the people critiquing what's happening with the other 3. And those 3 branches are supposed to be balancing and checking each other. But if we don't have that, then democracy breaks down pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Well, I think what a lot of people don't realize is from the beginning of the founding of our country, people like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, that they were at least part-time journalists, in some cases full-time. Both of them secretly owned newspapers, and they would funnel content into them. So, it's an integral part of democracy was to have the fourth estate that would serve as a check and a balance on the other 3 levels of the government. But, that's what's breaking down. And so now what you have is and thanks really in large part to social media, we have what I think one fellow in New York termed pink slime journalism. And this is basically political organizations creating newspapers, and it looks like a newspaper, and you get
radio and everything else.
And but it's got an agenda. And that really started back in the election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, and there were fake news things that started then, and it's just mushroomed from there. So there are lots and lots of these papers, and there's nothing to oversee who's doing it right, except for there's one organization that I know of called NewsGuard, and it rates news organizations, and it has. At least it gives you some criteria by which to judge them. and it's been I don't know how financially successful it's been, but that's one thing that is a hopeful sign. But in terms of most of the press, I mean, the small town little paper, there's still people out there. There are nonprofits that are taking up the slack. It's just that they can't pick up where the others left off. They don't have the money and the muscle to do it.
Right. So yeah, it does come down to the business models, right?
Yes.
That's what was upsetting to me, to see what happened with social media. And I think I mentioned I had a front row seat because Reid Hoffman was an investor in my last company, and he had, with Peter Thiel, made one of the first investments in Facebook, and then he of course created LinkedIn. Very smart guy, and very he's certainly a pro-democracy and openness, but just the business model of social media went straight to what we had with NBC, ABC, and CBS, which is monetize human attention. There was no subscription, circulation revenue. It's all ad based, and therefore and another piece of it is, of course, collecting that information, which you couldn't do as easily back with just television and with other one-way media. The fact that this is two-way means that you can collect information. And I remember one of the early things he said to me was, the beneficiaries of social media are not its users, right? Necessarily. Yeah. It's all that data. It's all that actionable information that comes from the activity of the people observing all this stuff. So, but I want to, before we get too far down the road here, I do want to talk about your Middle East Broadcasting Network thing. So I'm just going to pop this up here real briefly to frame it, but hopefully you're seeing this. But I was part of this little task group back right after 2016. This was out of the Pentagon. Shep Barge there is the director of Joint Assessment, whatever his long title is. We were looking at the effect of information warfare and the fact that we are so timid, or we're so timid in the U.S. about just putting out even counter narratives, because we considered that propaganda. And one of the determinants for this group of people here is we said, look, we have to stop. Let's call it something else then, and let's just talk about competing narratives, because that is the problem. That year, or in 2017, I think I told you this during lunch, I did this tour speaking in Italy, and I was in Bari and Venice and Rome and Florence, and speaking at universities. But I was talking about what happened in the Ukraine. I said in 2014, the president of Ukraine was moved out of office, let's say, and I'm interested in your opinion, audience. Was that a coup or was it a revolution? And the overwhelming response was, well, it was a Western-backed coup, but we understand why you guys did that. And I'm like, wait, that's not our story. That's not our narrative. Why do you think that's true? And they all said, in every city I went to, it was the same story. We hear about it on the news. This is what we've heard. And I dig into it to find out where they heard this story. And it's the Russian-backed Italian language TV station. And the thing is, we also had our counter narrative somewhat, but a little lighter and a little more timid about the claims we were making. But we were saying, hey, this was a revolution. The people just didn't like having this Russian puppet as their leader. He was corrupt. So the people threw him out. And probably the reality is somewhere in between. But the fact is, our information was being distributed around Europe in English.
Yes.
The Russians were smart enough to say, here's just a news station, and it's in Italian, and they flip over to it and they get the news from it, but it's actually a Russian television station. And so we need to really get smarter. So I'm glad to hear about what you're doing with the Middle East Broadcasting Network. But this idea of narratives of information and looking at everything is likely to have some kind of bias, and you want to understand what's the source, who else is repeating that information. And I think we could even do some of this with AI. We could have AI check to see how likely give it a score of how likely is this to be out, or do you need to really pause and ask some questions first before you just assume this news you just received is actually accurate?
Well, that would be fantastic, because you see, that's the Middle East broadcasting networks all Arabic language stations. So the news is delivered in Arabic. But as interestingly, as I was just exploring, expanding it a little bit to get some more awareness of what we were doing, because not everybody in the world speaks Arabic. And I was looking at the idea of just having an English language newsletter that would be sent out, that would be summarizing the stories to just get the message out of what we were doing. And in that process, I learned that in many Middle Eastern countries, the younger Arabic, the youth of those countries they like English because English is becoming, it's the language of the culture of the movies that they see. It's the language of the business that they are involved in. So I think the answer is to see if you can do both. And I think AI can really help in that regard. And Absolutely. Really, and also, make people aware that, you just can't believe everything that comes across your internet screen. You have to check things out, and you have to, it's more of an educational function. You have to educate people as to just not believe all of these kind of propaganda sites that are putting out stuff all over the place.
And I think, it started with make sure you question the written word that you're receiving. Right?
Yes.
The text that you're receiving, who produced it, how accurate is that? Well, who's the source? Who else is repeating that? And are they also good sources that are repeating? How extraordinary is the claim? You can score all this to give someone a warning that they might need to check a little bit further. But now we have to look beyond the written word. Now you can't trust what you hear.
Yeah, I know.
Do you think that's Donald Trump's voice or Barack Obama's voice or whoever? It may or may not be, but even when you can see them speaking, and with deep fake technology, you gotta wonder if it's even is this actually real footage that I'm
well,
seeing?
I know I've seen that. I remember seeing a presentation in which someone took the words of one person and put them in the mouths of the person that was on the screen, and you couldn't tell the difference. So you really have to be careful about what you're seeing, and the technology is fantastic in one sense, but it's got its dangers in another. And one of the mistakes I think all media, including myself, made is we didn't get in front of things like AI, and we didn't get in front of like a chat GPT and all that. They need to get in front of this and use it to the betterment of journalism, rather than be worried about it's going to replace journalists. It's not going to replace journalists. It's really I played around with it, and I found a lot of mistakes and a lot of things, and it was it actually can do some things pretty good. And it's, a lot of news organizations are already using it. The AP, the Washington Post, I think Bloomberg, like something like 30% of the earnings reports that Bloomberg does or the copy that Bloomberg produces is automatically generated. And so it's coming. And instead of fighting it, you have to get ahead of it and say, how can we use this to make the news more credible, to give people more faith, and to teach people what to look for, because most people don't know what to look for. That's the thing that I find really intriguing.
Yeah, technology as it advances has this tendency, or one of its virtues perhaps, is that it compresses matter, energy, space, and time. Right? The fact that you and I can have conversations like this wherever we happen to be in the world, so communication gets tighter, or it's easier to do. But what's interesting about some of the AI stuff that we, again, with my group have been playing with for quite some time, a couple of decades now, is that, you're looking at it and we think in terms of linear development. We're watching it develop, thinking, well, at this rate, it's going to be a really long time before it ever starts writing the newspaper for me, or writing a term paper, or writing a novel. But this technology doesn't tend to just gradually improve. It leaps at some point. So we've had a couple of leaps in the last year. I'd say even within the last month with Chat GPT, with DALI, some of the other OpenAI technologies, where now it's creating art on its own, it's creating text on its own. But as we get into the metaverse, because this is the metaversal minute, right?
Yeah.
You have to always think about like this thing that's manifesting on my screen, is it real or is it not? But not only will these systems be able to create text, audio, and video, they're going to be creating worlds. So the AI can create its own world with something happening within it. And we're going to have to understand, like, is that real? Is that a real reflection of what's happening? Or is that completely made up? And so we're going to need some new skills, maybe AI that counters the other AI. That's one thought. I mean, it's a very serious thought that we're considering.
Well, I think it's probably something that you're going to have to consider, because it could be a very potent vehicle for misinformation and disinformation. It has some of the stuff I played around with, it was pretty good, but it would have key factors that were wrong. I found it was one thing I found interesting with the Chat GTP is I put in some info. I put in I asked it to tell me about a certain person that I knew a lot about. A guy who was a early Irish revolutionary, and he became, for some reason, it's always puzzled me. He was a man with a lot of integrity, but he also happened to believe in slavery. And I could never figure out why he was like, but I asked the machine, who was this guy? And so it comes along and he says, he was this revolutionary, he's a very honorable guy, he did all these great things. And then he had a lot of sympathy he believed in slavery, but he had a lot of sympathy for African Americans. So I wrote them back and I said, that's absolutely not true. He believed basically that African Americans Africans were subhuman and it should be slaves because they couldn't do anything else. And when I looked it up the next time, all that was gone. They looked like they had corrected it already, which I thought was pretty interesting. I don't think they corrected; they just removed any reference to that. So, I mean, I think if you have a system of AI and machine learning that is producing this kind of copy, you're right. You need another system that checks it and tries to make sure that it's not wrong,
or at least have counter narratives. But when I get together with my other AI technologist friends, we open up a bottle of Macallan and start drinking and talking about it. It gets, the conversation gets pretty deep pretty fast, because one of the things we understand about playing with machine learning is you have to always be careful of what's called its utility function. The utility function is the goal you've set it, which is, hey, learn to play chess, learn to play the game of Go, learn to lose. I mean, you can set the goal, learn to lose every single game of chess, and it will solve for that, right?
Yeah.
But if you give it a goal to say, convince everybody in this region of the United States that this is true or not true, and then it can start devising its own path, because these systems, they don't tire, they don't take a break, they don't need insurance, they don't need days off or hours or minutes or seconds off, right? They can do they just can spend all of however much energy, compute power you give it. Its whole thing is just trying to solve that for that problem, whatever problem you get it. So it's conceivable that we could design systems that say, go convince everybody in Russia that, they should take out Vladimir Putin, and you'll get somebody to do it, right?
It's interesting.
It's dangerous stuff if all it's in is designing little things. And I tell a story about how we got to the point where we're all eating kale in the United States. And the idea is, I may have told you this story already.
Yeah.
But the idea is, like, let's say now, it must have been 8 years ago, nobody in the United States was eating kale.
Right.
So the Kale Growers Association hired a firm and started using this sort of Cambridge Analytica-like capability, which is model people. What are their current sets of beliefs and values and traditions? Now, how do you map them and then choose the susceptible group and move them on a little continuum of agreement with little micro bursts of information and influencers like Gwyneth Paltrow says this, Oprah says this, so and so says that. And you'll watch as they move from like, I'm never eating that stuff, it's terrible. But they start with like, darker green vegetables are slightly better for you than lighter ones. And everyone agrees. Oh, I've just moved them a little bit further along the continuum, right? But Rachel Ray has this new cookbook where you can make kale taste good. So they moved a little bit further along. Next thing you know, we're all walking into restaurants ordering kale for $15 a plate, right? And the piece I left out is 8 years ago. You know who the number one buyer of kale was in the United States?
Who was that?
It was Pizza Hut.
Pizza Hut.
And it was not for eating. It was just for putting on the ice around the salad bar. And that was it, because nobody was eating it. But now we're eating. It's on every menu.
Yeah.
Right? Avocado toast is the same thing. I mean, so that's a benevolent example of this technology, moving people towards, like, if we could use it for stop smoking and make better choices about your health care and driving, and don't drink as much, don't drink and drive, things like that. That would be beneficial. But of course it can also be used the other way. And go attack Nancy Pelosi's husband. You can make this stuff happen. So it's pretty crazy.
It's very easy to get to misuse it, and have the bad effects. I think though that overall it could have a very positive effect. Like you said, we talked once with one of our conversations about having a huge database that investigative journalists could tap into. That would save, I can't tell you how much time that would save you. A lot of the things that are being done now in the media with AI and machine learning are the tasks that were drudgery for most reporters. When I first became a journalist, the first thing you had to do is start writing obits. Now, obits, and the reason they made you do that is because there are a lot of facts in obits that you can get wrong. Name spelling, wrong address, wrong age, all these other things. And you had to start on that. But it was, you couldn't wait to get off of it because it was a real formulaic piece kind of writing. And now you can now, of course, most newspapers now don't even publish obits anymore. They just basically, and if you do, they charge you for it. So but that kind of work, earnings reports, obituary, the weather story. I mean, how many times can you write? You write a weather story 3 times a day. How many times a day can you say the weather's bad? I mean, how many different ways? So these kinds of functions can be really helpful. Huh?
I said, still sunny in San Diego, and 75 degrees.
But those kinds of stories could be used. So if you do that. Now, they say that if you do that, you can free up a journalist, that the journalist can go off and do some investigative reporting. My experience has been that when you begin doing that and you begin getting machine learning and AI to produce those stories, they'll just cut the reporters and they won't rededicate them. So you have to make sure that it's in the right hands. But I think if it's in the hands of some of these nonprofits and others, they will use it more creatively because they don't have a lot of the same concerns, and they're not producing a lot of this kind of rote journalism that everybody really didn't like to do.
Yeah, I mean, all of these technologies are always a double-edged sword, like the nuclear power, double-edged sword. It can provide us nearly limitless, power too cheap to meter is what we said originally. But then there's all the downsides of it, the danger of it, the security threat of it. Of course, now I think we've advanced to the point where we can, if we all just made thorium molten salt reactors, they can't melt down. They produce that energy. It's a very cheap energy. It's a very abundant material. So we can find a way to start using it if we can just control that narrative. But when it comes to the information technology and how fast it's advancing, I think we have to try to really have policy and incentives and business models that accentuate these better outcomes for society. But who's going to care about that except a hopefully benevolent government? You know, I mentioned to you earlier that the book, The Wealth of Networks, was written by this guy, Benkler. He talked about the networked fourth estate, and he had this really positive image about it, that the netizen, the netizens, he called them, the citizen journalist out there, it's going to enable this army of people who are keeping an eye on the town council, the county commissioners, the mayors, the local police departments, all that stuff. But that doesn't not seem to have happened.
No, well,
what if we could design AIs that serve that function, investigative journalist AIs, who are really just looking behind the scenes, listening and watching and looking for patterns of behavior that, where they can call the humans to come in and take a closer look. I think that's a viable, that's actually a very reasonable thing. I don't know how we fund it or get it done, because I'm not sure what the business model is for that either, except we should all be interested in it happening.
When I was the editor of the LA Times, one of the big debates was always, should we be a local newspaper and cover Los Angeles? Should we be a state newspaper? Or should we be the West Coast equivalent of the New York Times? And the answer was usually the West Coast equivalent of the New York Times, because that's what everybody wanted to be. But if I would have had, and I always tried to figure out, okay, how can there's a huge challenge here of covering this massively diverse city. The circulation area of the Los Angeles Times is as big as the state of Ohio, and it ranges from desert areas to ghettos. And if you would have had an artificial intelligence mechanism that could crawl through the public records of all these things and pick out trends that you could assign a reporter to, I could have done both. I could have done what I needed to do, and I could have had a staff assigned. But I think the point that you frequently make, and a point that I heartily agree with you on, is you have to have a marriage of the human and the artificial intelligence. Without that marriage, you're going to have a lot of divorces. So it really means it can be very, very useful, and can really be a powerful vehicle to help keep a check on government and corruption and all of that. And so you just have to have the marriage of those two forces that will help you create a system where you can perform the functions of the fourth estate. The government may have to be the catalyst for the revenue to create this. Part of the problem is, in journalism circles, there's always been a distrust and almost a knee-jerk reaction to any kind of government involvement. And, it's because the first paper in this country was a publication called the Public Occurrences. And it came up with all kinds of grand ideas of how it was going to cover things, and it was going to eliminate corruption and everything. And the first thing they did is they published a story that the governor of, I think it was Massachusetts, didn't like, and he shut it down. So it had one edition. And ever since then, there's been a large distrust of government involvement in the news industry. But I think we've come to a point.
We don't want Pravda, right?
Yeah.
We don't want state-owned media. That's not healthy.
No, it's not.
Separate and independent.
We might have come to a point where we need something kind of like a DARPA in this Defense Department to come up with ideas and invest in things that they can turn over to the private sector.
And that's what we were talking about with that thing that I flashed up earlier is, RAND Corporation, a couple other think tanks are thinking about this idea that it is, the minute you reframe it from like, well, it's just, businesses out there making money, providing information to the public. Instead, you say, no, it is a national security issue and something that's unique to a democracy with an open flow of ideas is that we got to make sure that they're healthy. And if it starts being controlled by one or more small groups, just like we break up trusts, or used to at least, because we didn't think that was the right thing for the public good. And it's why we there are certain aspects of a democracy that are only left to the hopefully benevolent governing powers of, our government, like, interstate commerce, prosecution of war. I think it should be education and healthcare as well.
Yeah.
But we sort of think education should be slightly socialized, but not. It's becoming more private. So I think this idea of the curation of information needs to be healthy and supported. I'm not unsure of exactly how to do that without calling it government involvement. Right.
Well,
it's a national security issue.
Yeah, I one of the reasons that I decided to accept this chairman of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks was to get some experience. I've never worked with the government in the government media, and I called Amanda Bennett, who is the head of the Agency for Global Media now, but prior to that, she was the head of Voice of America. And I asked her, she's the former editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and many other papers and worked for Bloomberg. And we have a lot of colleagues in common. And I asked her, I said, I've never done this where I work for the something that's got ties to the government. And, how did you deal with this at the Voice of America? And she said, it's no different than working for the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, or the LA Times. You've got the government over there, and they're probably going to give you some problems, just like advertisers used to give you problems when you wrote stories that they didn't like, and they used to threaten to pull their advertising. She said it's the same sort of thing, and that she didn't find any real problem with it, and she rarely had someone lean on her to censor or keep a story off of a newscast. So I think there might be a role for the government as a catalyst to start something, because to start some kind of vehicle to just begin providing funding that's needed to just get these things off the ground, and then to back away from them. Because if you look at the history of journalism, the best way, the best delivery of journalism has always been for for-profit companies who could stand on their own 2 feet, and they were independent. So when I was at the Chicago Tribune, I can't tell you how many times I had advertisers come in and threaten to pull all their advertising because they didn't like a story. And I would just tell them, you can't go there. We don't do that. That's not the way it works. So, and 9 out of 10 times, they never pulled their advertising because, frankly, they needed their audience as much as we did. So I think we might have come to a point, though, that where the government needs to create some kind of, like I said, like a DARPA kind of agency that invest in the technology and invest in news delivery techniques and news editing techniques and news gathering techniques that will be transferred over gradually to for-profit entities that would give you the kinds of journalism you need. We can't keep going the way we are because it's not working. And frankly, I mean, I think the artificial intelligence and machine learning that I looked at, I think has a lot of potential. It's got problems, and as I said before, you have to have that marriage of the technology and the human involvement, because the human is the person who's going to be able to see what might be wrong and might be able to serve as the check on the information.
And to make sure that the utility functions are still human utility functions and goals and not machine ones. That's a great place to wrap up. But it's, again, a great pleasure talking to you. But I think we just had another round of violent agreement like we have in all of our conversations, which I think is good. Hopefully it's good. And I'm sure we'll find things to disagree about in the future. But right now we're in agreement that the most important thing to get right is the right balance between humans and machines to optimize the outcome. You just got to be careful of what that outcome is you're trying to optimize for. And It shouldn't be for the government. It shouldn't be for advertisers. It should be for the healthiest societies we can build. And that means truth, checks and balances, all that stuff. So if people want, I'm sure this audience is going to want to engage in this conversation a bit more. Is there a place where they can reach you if they want to ask more questions? Are you on Twitter or Any
Well,
of
I'm
these
on
other?
Twitter. I have a website, jeoshay.com, which has a blog, and it has ways to contact me. They could use my email as jim at jeoshay.com. It's pretty easy to remember.
Right.
Or call me.
Well, be careful of that. Be careful what you
Yeah.
ask for.
Well,
Again,
I never tire about talking about journalism. They spent my life in it, and I think it's a very honorable cause. And I went through many different iterations of a journalist, from being a basic cub reporter all the way to being the editor of one of actually the single largest daily newspaper in the United States. So it's I've got a lot of experience with it, and I really don't get too tired of talking about it.
no, and I value your perspective deeply, and I'm so thankful that you're writing books. So at least we're capturing this information for now and the future as you're reflecting upon all this that you've done. Thank you for joining us for this. I hope that was helpful. And I hope the community out there reads all your books and follows you, and we continue to work towards a better design for all of us. So
Okay,
that's
thank you
it
very
for
much.
now. Yeah, thank you everybody, and happy holidays again, and
Happy
we'll see
holidays.
you in the metaverse.
Okay, thank you.